And well, I want to thank everyone for giving us some time here to advance this project. So I'm going to start out by telling you what it's about, and then I'll try and make clear what it is we're looking for help with, and perhaps collaboration in the future too. So this initiative is a program of the National Science Foundation that they started 2 years ago under a previous administration, and their motivation was to try and make geosciences, and that's a division within the NSF which supports climate science and geology, oceanography, environmental science. And they want to make the results that have been achieved in those programs more useful to communities and the private sector. And so they created this initiative that required proposers to form teams that would be regional in scope and would participate in a process with 2 phases. The first phase, well, for groups that win, phase 1 was to develop a plan, a proposal, which would yield products that would be directly useful and for communities and states, and that would address problems that were fundamental in scope but practical in use, and that the teams should include academics and private sector and be driven and influenced at least by user groups. So I led a proposal from University of Connecticut, University of Maine, Brooklyn College, and Stevens Institute of Technology, and we argued that we could do what they wanted in the Northeast. And the phase 1 proposal funding is about $500,000 for 2 years, and most of that money, when you divide it by 4, right, 4 institutions, it doesn't go very far. And it's mostly about hosting meetings and writing reports and trying to formulate teams that would then compete for a second phase. Phase 2 would actually be conducting work, doing research, writing papers and reports, etc., and maybe even implementing projects, at least demonstration projects. And that would be a four-year, $10 million program. And you had to win phase 1 competition to be eligible for phase 2. And so we won phase 1. And now we're trying to create a team and a program that would be competitive in phase 2. Let's go next one, Nicole. So here I'm going to overview. Sorry, let me just review this. So we're going to I'm going to blab on a little bit more about the process and the project. Then we'll talk about some things that we think might be useful projects that geosciences could deliver that would be useful for real projects. And we want you guys who have been involved in real projects to give us feedback on whether you think that things that we think are important are actually important. And then that will guide us on how to develop a proposal. But one of the things that I think that has been inhibiting adaptation project implementation is a lag between what we understand and policy development. Some policies that were developed for towns and state agencies, standards, etc., were developed in the 70s and 80s, and they're not based on what we understand about climate and geosciences and meteorology now, and geology too. And so Luann is going to give a short summary of things that she thinks are important. And it's not just us. We've already talked to other groups across the region and about the science and policy issues. But this is our first attempt to engage people who are actually doing projects and know the problems and challenges better than us. And then John will lead a discussion about what we should be doing next. And then at the end, we'll wrap up. So here's the summary slide that came from the text that NSF developed. We want to support translational research into practical, scalable solutions to regional resilience problems through innovative collaborations. So that's in short form what I just said. let's go to the next one. And we're number 4 there in the Northeast, and we're not covering the whole thing. I think there's about 16 teams were funded in phase 1. And we're sort of focused, given the resources that we have in the states that are participating, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and Maine. But we're interested in other people too, but we just don't have as much capacity to engage people in the other states. These are the NSF program managers who initiated the idea. So within NSF, there's competition for how to spend money. And these people advocated for this initiative. And they were pretty successful but the administration that was elected, that started last year, has changed priorities. So it's not entirely clear whether there's going to be a phase 2 or a phase 2 in the way that they originally conceived. But they are committed to try and create opportunities for proposals through NSF that would be it would yield products of the type that they envisioned. Though it might not be labeled R2I2 in the end, and it might not be a defined $10 million per project. So we'll talk more about that later. Okay, next one. What we have to do in this project is to identify the climate challenges facing municipalities, identify some solutions and strategies to address them. Number 3 is assess the regional needs for education and training, and John's going to discuss that with us at the end here. Then we need to have a sustainable plan to meet regional needs, and by that we mean how to sustain something like circa. That's what I meant anyway. So I'm open to modification and improvement, obviously, but at the end of the project, we want to have a plan that's regional in scope and links the academic basic research capacity with people involved in practical projects to address climate change needs. And then we need a plan to sustain it for the future, because doing these projects takes decades, as we've come to learn. Next, thanks. So this is a little bit description of our structure. We've got these 3 big groups, and the blue groups are working groups that will develop themes and ideas for projects and discuss priorities. The green boxes are advisors and potential collaborators, and you're part of that. We're looking for you to help us prioritize and triage, at least maybe what's important to do and what's not important to do. And these are the bottom here. They're the institutions and the administrative structure for making decisions. In the event that there is like a phase 2, that we'll have to actually create a budget for $10 million. And so not everything that we would all like to do is going to be in that. And so there's a need for some decision making, and this project review committee and the project management committee are going to be helpful in hopefully compromising and prioritizing something that's competitive and useful. Next. So this is the schedule, and this is where we are, the second arrow here. We're going to be delivering a report at the end of that's August, I guess, 2027.
Oh yeah, the final report.
The final report, but there's a report that's also due in September of 26, and that was originally conceived to be an outline of a proposal. Next one. These are all the characters that are the lead PIs. We don't need to recognize some of them, and the other ones, hopefully you'll meet. Next one. And this is the circus staff, largely. You know a lot of those. So let's go to the grant themes.
All right, so
well, I think that Yaprak's going to discuss those, but I just want to take a break for a second to see if anyone's got questions about what I said.
Yeah.
Thanks. Nicole's going to be managing the hands if everybody wants to raise it, or you can just unmute and pipe up.
Yeah, right now it looks like there are no questions. So
Right.
I actually did have a question. You might not know the answer to this given the uncertainty of the funding, but did originally what was of the 16 that were selected for phase 1, was the idea to select one final for phase 2, or were there more than one teams?
Yeah, there were. I think the original thinking was to be 3 or 4 $10 million awards
Nationally?
nationally.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so it wasn't all or nothing, right? And you know, and so now that there's, thanks for bringing that question forward, because it did remind me of something I meant to say, and that is, even though so the funds that were available were not sufficient to motivate me to do this. Unless the $10 million did motivate me, but so now, but the reason that we did it, and we're going forward anyway, is that we believe that this is a useful approach that's good for Circa anyway. We do want to create new collaborations. We want to understand what you think are important and that things that we can do. And I think it's useful to collaborate with other institutions in neighboring states because they've got complementary capacity in sometimes, and they've got sort of a different connections to towns and municipalities that might make what we do actually more valuable. So irrespective of whether we win or not, this is probably going to be a useful thing. Of course, still want to win.
And there might be other proposals.
Oh yeah,
that might come from this whole process.
We definitely want to develop proposals that from groups and subgroups that we fertilize through this process to other competitions. There's going to be lots of opportunities for that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Kyle.
and it looks
Yeah,
like
thanks. I just had a question on kind of like the role of other institutions and other like co-PIs. Like I talked to, I saw recently Brett from the Brooklyn College at the Coastal Conference in New Jersey, and we were chatting a little bit about this. Like, are there separate working groups for sub-regions, or I guess geographically, like the folks on this call, is this like limited to certain states, or is it kind of all one big working group Northeast?
Yeah. My view here is that we want to be fertilizing new collaborations. So if we can do things across the Northeast, that's going to be, one, useful, and two, it's part of the formula that NSF would use to assess whether or not phase 2 is going to be a priority. So if we only focus on projects that are in Connecticut, right, we're not likely to be viewed as being a national significance. Okay, let's move on.
Yeah, and I guess just a quick on the structure of the meetings and so forth. Those working groups that were on that slide are going to be across. So if there's a working group that focuses on nature-based solutions, for instance, which I think that is one of the working groups, it's going to be people across the Northeast in that one working group, and not just one for Connecticut and one for Massachusetts. Yep. And so on.
Got it. So, thank you.
Yep.
Okay.
Good.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So these are the identified grant teams that you are seeing on screen: flood hazard mapping, flood adaptation modeling and decisions, flood predictions and alerts, nature-based features, wind hazard, and heat and health risk. I'm going to move through these teams quickly because I'm not going to deep dive into the science as experts that working on all of these things. You know this space. What we are really looking for to learn from you is like where things are breaking down, what is like missing in real world decisions, and where the science can actually help to progress like real life adaptation solutions. So I'm less interested in presenting and more from like interest in learning from you. Do we have, and this is going to be more like interactive session since we are a small group here. Is anyone want to start with one particular team, or otherwise I'm going to go through them and then ask questions, and then we can do discussions along the way. No.
Yeah, Brock, did you say start with one particular theme?
Yeah,
Is
I
that what
can
you were
start with,
asking?
yes, exactly. Like, is there anything that is like you want to discuss first from these 6 themes, or otherwise I'm just gonna go through the list? Good, all right.
I'm muted.
No, you're good now.
So if you thought the biggest challenge that science needs to advance to help us address a problem was flood adaptation modeling, right? Then we could go there first, or if it's wind
Yeah.
hazard, go there first, right? But
I guess let's move on.
let's just move on then.
Yeah, let's start with the flood hazard mapping. So we know that maps are widely used, and they're often like backward looking and not really capturing the future and local solutions. So these are like less to say that I'm going to dive deep into like what we know, and we can do large scale models, but they can be insufficient for planning and regulatory decisions, and small scale ones are like local outcomes can differ, so it cannot be like used from one place to another one. So I'm gonna start with asking here, because this is going to be a discussion, like where do you think that the current flood maps are failed into making decision making? You can just jump in. Yeah, Elsa.
I mean, I think the obvious one is that the FEMA mapping only takes fluvial flooding into account, that we don't have pluvial and stormwater flooding. And that's a lot of our like short-term risk lives in that space, that we have a false feeling that that's not a danger when we look at these maps.
Yeah. Kyle?
Yeah, I would certainly echo the pluvial flooding, and you know, while there have been advances, especially in specific states, on downscale modeling, it's hard to do that at scale, and the entities that have done that at scale are often proprietary products that are not necessarily available even to the state. So I mean, I applaud, like, Connecticut's insurance has made First Street Flood Foundation data available, which does include pluvial, but it's one model, right? You would rather have a couple different sources that have done that to like cross-check, and it's just otherwise very, you know, resource intensive to do that kind of pluvial modeling everywhere.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so I want to chime in. Can't stop myself, but Nicole's going to be able to mute me if I go too long. So so for example, I have 2 points. One is, I'm glad to hear that we all agree on that. But is there a regulatory hurdle to using more modern models, or is it that engineering companies have been trained, or people in the engineering companies have been trained to use a certain set of things, and it's therefore more costly for them to use something that's more innovative and new and higher resolution? Or
I mean, quickly, I could say that most zoning and most regulatory decisions are still based on FEMA data. So yes.
Mm-hmm.
So even if we did do some additional work to make more modern stuff available to you, you would still have to do the old stuff anyway, unless we change regulation.
Regulations, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other challenge with stormwater is sometimes, the actual stormwater infrastructure and asset information is, depending on the municipality, you get limited access to a piece of it that you're working on, and you don't necessarily have access to the whole system and understanding things comprehensively. So it's not only the actual pluvial component, but also the stormwater infrastructure component.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that comment. I think if you're even going to rely on the existing statewide proprietary data, that's only going to get you so far. It might be fine for like a coarse scale vulnerability assessment, but in order to actually address problems, on the ground, you're going to need to take into account the stormwater, drainage system and all those intricacies with the hydraulics of the system. And that's where some of these, what we've done with the projects, for working on various locations in Connecticut under the CIRCA's, program, inevitably you're looking at more detailed models, than that. So having recognized the limitations of that statewide data, the coarse scale, it is definitely limited. helpful, but to a certain point. And then once you get into design, you're looking at more detailed information, anyway.
I've
Yeah.
also seen that create some reverse incentives too, where, if one community wants to go above and beyond what the state standard is, they're free to do that, but what's their incentive to pay for that? And then it's also, I've come across communities that would like to do that, but they also don't want to discourage development and push it to another community that's not going to a higher standard, right? So they want to still develop, but they,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, so the First Street stuff that the Department of Insurance just sponsored
In Connecticut.
in Connecticut, yeah, that's a good example of something that could be better, but it doesn't have any drainage stuff. The local stormwater management systems aren't really accessible to them.
Yeah, they make a bunch of simplifying assumptions on it, and they try to get at it, but yeah, most of the time, stormwater asset level data is not public.
Is that a regulatory restriction, or is that just like a data management problem that hasn't been resolved?
I think it's a challenge in data management. I mean, every town has a different level of data. Their storm
Yeah.
system data is, some have great GIS data with elevations of their structures. Others have information on paper, on as-built drawings, and bringing that together in like a uniform statewide layer is a huge effort. That
Mhm.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges with the scaling problem, going from the municipality up to statewide with something that's like uniform and consistent is the data.
So yeah, so would it be fair to say accelerate, if we could accelerate the development of we could accelerate design development if we had faster and more convenient access to all of your all of this kind of infrastructure data. So Dean is not getting unmuted. Can you fix that, Nicole?
Yeah, I don't know why that
I
would
got it.
be.
Oh,
While
God.
we're
Somehow it came
working
on
on
after I
that,
typed in. I was like, oh, they clearly know me well enough. They've permanently muted me. Yeah, the only thing I was going to add is just the data to come up with a designable, like you could rely on a pluvial model requires a lot of information that's expensive to collect. And that's a big hurdle, especially if you're going to try to do something statewide. Like, it's much more cost effective to focus on problem areas than focus on really good data collection, because invert depths, size of pipes, condition of structures, like that all feeds into that model. And you're opening up thousands of structures, for some of these
Yep.
models.
Yeah, it's hard to get down to that level of data that's even 12-inch pipes is like a threshold that we often work with when talking about like 2070 10-year storm data, but that data and inverts aren't going to exist at that level in a lot of communities. Like, that's a data collection upfront effort most of the time. So I agree with that. Kind of like, if you can pre-sort some of the problem areas and do that, that's more cost effective. But if you're trying to do that for every 12-inch pipe, that's a monumental effort.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be a challenge, but it would be valuable if we could figure out an innovative way to do that. Right?
Oh yeah.
I mean, a lot of these problems have to do with asset management. In some way, they're an asset management problem at the same time, right? To your point about, differences in data. And I do think that there's an interesting nexus here from, understanding how a municipality manages its assets and the data it has around that, and how that might intersect with, understanding vulnerabilities, in this case to, stormwater flooding. But again, that's more on the asset management side. So not sure how that can be solved.
Yeah, just adding to that, I think a challenge is the capacity that exists in various communities, and how who has what data where, and how they have that stored, or how it can be accessed. And I just wanted to also add on to something that Kyle had said earlier. I think one of the other reasons it matters is that people are increasingly losing confidence in the FEMA data, which sort of, because it doesn't match the reality of what they're seeing, or they say, well, no, we also see flooding here and it's not reflected in the mapping. And I think that can be tricky because it starts to undermine the trust in the data that people are seeing coming from, quote unquote, trusted sources. So I think that's another reason why it matters to get a better picture of realistically what's happening, what people are seeing in their lived experience with flooding.
There's also an issue, I think, with translating the data into decision making, and the variety of ways that you can use the data to predict future conditions, and how you make choices on that in terms of taking action on infrastructure or the built environment.
How are we doing on
Hi,
time?
everybody.
Yeah, I
Good.
think
Yeah.
so I think like what I'm hearing is like the regulatory challenges, and then the data management and collection and making it uniform is a problem because it's expensive and is very big asset management problem and the idea. So I think this was like good, and now we can move on to the next one because they are all like connected anyways. Next, we have flood adaptation modeling and decision making. So we, like Jim mentioned, that there's first street model, there's everybody makes models, and you guys are making with moving and preparing models too, but they're not consistently used in decision making. A part of it is also we are going back to the regulatory challenges. If it's not a FEMA model, sometimes it's not getting accepted. But let's say that like for your specific area, you are using a model. Is it you're using it just because that you have to, or is there like some kind of, what is making your model decision ready for you? What is an acceptable uncertainty for you?
Yeah, so let me just frame that a little more narrowly to start off with. And that is, so if for example, we were to, like in an area like Mystic, say that there's a particular area that's going to get flooded more frequently by 2050, and you have to draw a line on a map and which would have implications for what the town would allow. If you're above this elevation or outside this area, you can do things. And if you're inside it, you can't. Right? What accuracy of what model prediction would be necessary in order to justify or allow a town to do that, and then have them be able to back it up in court should they get sued? I mean, in a moment we're using FEMA maps, right? But we're agreed, I think, that they're inadequate for going forward, and they're probably not even accurate at small scales, anyway. But if we were to go to make other decisions and create other maps, what would be the standard?
Kyle?
I mean, I do think you'll have trouble at any point getting consensus on one model to trust. I think that's the challenge. Everyone thinks that if you just build the best possible product, everyone will use it. But I think a lot of decision makers like to see agreement between a couple models before making such a decision as to say, like, okay, we can't develop in this area. Like, that's a pretty big decision to make in terms of influencing land use decisions and such. So, I certainly would love to believe that there's a model that everyone would trust, but it's not often the case on the ground. And if that model result says something that people don't like, they're going to push back on it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Jim, you opened a can of worms with the last thing you said about when you said, well, if you go to a courtroom, and the reality is this is all very new still. There's no what matters in a courtroom is standard of care. there isn't a standard of care right now.
Mhm.
Like everyone's still
Yes.
figuring it out. Like there's no, I think that's it's probably something. Yeah, I don't even know like how it would get defended. We see lawsuits now with engineering firms and climate resilience decisions, happening in some big judgments against engineering firms. I think really what would be nice is this, the state of Connecticut, for example, set a standard, maybe not a model, but a resilient standard as to what needs to be, evaluated. That would help from a liability and standard of care, standpoint, that you could point back to something. You're not necessarily guessing. And the other thing I'd tell you about the modeling and the risk, or the quality of the modeling, the type of model, I think it's also a function of risk. And you know what, if it's a $50 million asset, you know what, I would be a lot more sensitive about the quality of the model, the quality of the data, getting into that model, versus, a road race project of, 10 houses. And, there's less sensitivity to that. And okay, maybe the worst case scenario, the road gets wiped out, but the houses don't. And, that's less sensitivity than, say, a 500 home neighborhood, behind something where, so it's sort of like, in my opinion, like a little bit, you'll know it when you see it. And in terms of defining what the standard of care probably should be in some of those instances, and the quality of the model and quality of the data.
Okay.
Alana?
I think we're,
Uh-huh.
oh, excuse me.
Oh, or, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, I think I am interested in, monitoring technologies and sensors, and how I really think that is, again, I don't know the body of research that's been done on that. We're currently working with the Nature Conservancy right now in Florida to, address kind of try to understand how sensors can, really help us with, broader stormwater kind of watershed issues. So I am really interested in, what is that feedback loop, and how can we use those technologies and potentially, AI, to kind of help optimize the modeling process.
Elsa?
I think it's very interesting that we're entering this period in our modeling where there's so much uncertainty. And so I agree with Dean. I echo that it seems like it's coming back to this idea of risk. So like in Massachusetts, they have the RMAT. So you're looking at what are the critical assets? What is their useful life? And so you develop that sort of like standardization of what the risk is, and then can come up with the appropriate design period. I think that also reflects into, like Dean was saying, the modeling that you're doing. And I think we're finding, as we're moving into this territory of future casting and, projecting based on these ranges, that we're seeing. I was just at the New York panel on climate change yesterday, and this exact same conversation came up, where we're seeing that we're needing to look at things over the range and really prepare for, well, this might be, lowest case, and this is highest case for our design scenario, and how we're even still looking at these things in terms of model results as like, this is our 90th percentile. Everything below here, 90% of the data returned from this model was below this number. And even if you're designing then to that elevation, that number that the model returned, it's not your worst case scenario. It's still only your 90th percentile. So, this is a really compelling question. We were asking the same questions yesterday about what is our legal responsibility in terms of the, the standard that we designed to. So the New York is currently developing a similar protocol to RMAT and trying to figure out, with RMAT, like that's not codified either, right? That is just invoked through a funding mechanism. So trying to figure out if there's a way that they can work that in as well, but it gives everyone that baseline that I think, when you look at the legality of things, a lot of it becomes precedent. And so if there is an existing precedent to be able to design to, that's something that can protect our clients as well as protect our industry, protect the practitioners.
Yeah. That's actually very good. So it comes to the like having a more guideline or like an understanding for like resilience standardization that can show you and then show the customers the legal risk that they're taking for these decisions too. I'm going to now move to the next one, which comes to the Ileana's actually point, because it's flood predictions and flood alert systems. So and this is have like two aspects of it, like if they're operational flood forecast models, if anyone is using that, but also there's also flood alert systems. Since Ileana, you mentioned about like how they can use your thing, trying to figure that out. If you would have had an access to like a reliable street level like monitoring system, what would you do differently in your designs?
I mean, I think we'd love to have data that's not just a point in time. A lot of the climate modeling are taken as several points in time, and so I think having monitoring systems that can actually give us more fluid, sorry, no pun intended, more fluid data would be, I think, very valuable to understand. To someone's point earlier about is the data reliable? If people are ground truthing things and they're actually not in alignment with, FEMA flood models or maps, then, how can we really ground truth it? So I think that's how we would love to use it, is to really, the models can only tell us so much. And so.
Yep. Kyle?
Yeah, a couple things here. I think when you're talking about real-time decision making or nowcasting, things like that, a lot of times the entities that are really at the forefront of that are transportation entities, port authorities or people that need to shut down roads, and make a decision very fast. And, a lot of those models that are out there, even the ones that are good, aren't necessarily the same ones that you would use to make decisions about, do I deploy a flood barrier around my specific property at this specific time, which is increasingly a challenge. I'd say, like,
do you think it's because of a communication of those models or like the systems are not really designed for decision makers?
it's a little bit of both. I think
yeah.
I think especially with the latter case being like so site specific, like what am I depending on? And a lot of these forecasting things are based on where the data is being collected, like rain gauges in a certain place or a tide gauge sensor in a certain place. Like you can look at the availability of tide gauge sensors and there's a lot of spatial gaps along shorelines that are pretty far between. And if you're relying on one specific point in a harbor, on the other side of the harbor, their water levels might be a foot different or half a foot different. So, I do think that there's research being done to try to close some of those gaps, whether by machine learning or triangulation. But like, it's hard when a lot of this data is based on NOAA data that are very point specific, and you're trying to make decisions farther and farther away from that point.
Yeah. Diane?
Yeah, I was just curious on this topic, particularly, where is the interaction with the National Weather Service? They've traditionally, right, been the flooding forecasting folks. They've worked more recently on more inundation modeling. Obviously their focus has been, coastal areas and main stem rivers, primary tributaries. So it's a little bit different in the work that they do. I know a lot of the alert type of the sort of alert systems that people were interested in. I know the state of Connecticut is trying to get funding for, I'm not sure the status of that, was to, kind of give those real-time alarms where there was data lacking, previously, or modeling wasn't necessarily getting the job done. But I think there's a real opportunity there to, those are the folks who have been doing main stem flood forecasting for decades, have evolved that technology. And I think that's an intersection that really should happen. The other challenge too, I think, with alert systems is the maintenance. It's one thing to, and we've seen this with USGS gauges, right? It's one thing to get them installed. It's another thing to make sure that they're funded for and maintained for a long enough period of time. So how do you do that? Do you do that through the state? Do you do that through the National Weather Service? Do you do that through USGS? What's the mechanism to make that be sustainable over a long period?
Yeah. Elsa?
I just wanted to quickly throw out there, because this is peripheral, one way that we're using sensors right now is in large urban water bodies that are connected to the stormwater system or just receive direct runoff. We have developed, or worked with partners to develop a system that uses that 5-day forecast of the National Weather Service. So looking 5 days out into the future, and then is, automated, SCADA operated, so that it will drop the impoundment and allow for additional storage within that water body. So it's all happening, like it's figuring it out behind the scenes to figure out what this projected precipitation will be, and then lowering the impoundment in advance. So kind of a cool use of something that really is a force multiplier, can really take out the labor in the process.
Yeah, thanks for all those comments. That's terrific.
That's very.
And I think these three areas we just discussed are sort of overlapping in some ways. And so, for example, the standard of care question about development of rules for future development. It's easy. It's not easy, but floods. I mean, First Street have done it already, right? You just download a bunch of LiDAR data, get some river gauge data, and make forecasts without actually doing ever any on-the-ground site analysis anywhere. And so clearly, it seemed to me that First Street like products would not withstand much scrutiny, because they're evidently wrong in many places where flooding occurs. But
I'd say they're a model, they're not a forecast.
Well,
right?
but a forecast and a model, forecast is basically using a modeling and data in a different way. So if you had like a high resolution model which had drainage networks and catch basins and stuff in it for an area of Hartford, you could use it to simulate what would happen in a 100-year event, precip event, or you could use it operationally to forecast what's going to happen tomorrow if you get a 1-inch event, right? So the underlying science is the same, but to make it useful for important things, and there needs to be measurements, or at least a protocol to evaluate quantitatively that it is reliable. And I think that's how the FEMA maps were evolved. You have to do this and that, and you have to meet this standard. And once that's done, you can get a letter of map revision, or you can make a state can get a new map. And then all of the following uses, all of the uses can use it.
So,
but can we develop a new one, or would that be useful if it was a Connecticut-wide product, or could it be just for a particular city? How would you make use of such a product if it could be developed?
I think, like, from what I heard from the group, is that ground truthing was really good way of using, like Jim iterated, but also the usability needs a little bit of, there's a gap between how the decision makers and how the modelers and how everybody, or like a National Weather Service, is going to use, and then the maintenance is the problem. So I'm gonna move to the next one right now, for the sake of time. And we have nature-based solutions, and you've been also designing these things too. We know they provide benefits, but the adaptation of this, like applications, are still limited. So do you think that what is stopping from nature-based solutions being applied today? Is it like the permitting problems, or like something, or a cost, or something else?
My perspective is that it's not easy to work with regulators in the state of Connecticut, and they limit the ability to be creative with designs to better ensure the longevity of the nature-based solutions you develop. You don't want to spend money developing a nature-based solution that gets wiped out in the first nor'easter. And for example, rules that you can't incorporate, hard elements, and even though it might be buried into the design, is really limits applications in a lot of environments versus other places where, like Chesapeake Bay and Gulf Coast, where those elements would be readily allowable to be incorporated into the design. I'm glad to see Deep starting to incorporate, develop marsh raising projects. 5 years ago, they were dead set against it. So shows some adaptability in that respect. But in my opinion, more work needs to be done.
Well, exactly. What kind of work? That's exactly what we want to do.
Yeah.
Be more creative with the designs, and maybe there's a working group with, like, okay, if we're really serious about incorporating coastal nature-based features, what are we going to allow in our regulations to be incorporated into these designs? For example, I'll give you an example. Milford, Connecticut. Eric is familiar with this project, where we just had these short little berms at these end of roads, these sand dunes, and they wouldn't even allow us to put in like Christmas trees to try to, or a burrito to try buried inside the dunes to try to maximize the resilience of those dunes so they don't get blown out by the next nor'easter. So it's little things like
Dean,
that.
was it Deep? Was it Deep that pushed back?
Yep.
Interesting.
So,
Was there an ecological reason, like
No,
habitat?
just no hard
or-
elements.
Okay, it's just a hard and fast rule,
Yeah,
essentially.
no hard elements.
Is there some kind of a data they will require to confidently,
I'll be honest
invest?
with you, it's not just Deep. Like Rhode Island is the same. No hard elements incorporated into the design. And like
It's
we had
interesting.
a project.
Because you see it in New Jersey, like they're allowing it further down the coast.
Right.
Yeah. And like it's common, expected, like you need your burrito or you're going to lose your dune. It's just really interesting that locally it changes that much.
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes down to places are starting to put into place standards for this, but it's still not getting enforced at the level, partly because the agencies themselves are learning the process themselves too for some of these nature-based projects. Nature-based is also a wide window, but is
Right.
beach nourishment considered a nature-based process? Are small stone rock revetments and riprap nature-based? In some places people will say they are. I mean, I think that's one of the things that drove New Jersey just recently to say, nature-based features have to have a living component to them. Like they had to specify that because the rule was getting stretched so far by people just putting riprap everywhere.
Riprap's natural, right? Boy, I was going to mention something. So TNC, by the way, did a study, and it's not that old. It might be 3 or 4 years ago. It was actually led by Mass TNC chapter on regulatory constraints throughout New England on implementing nature-based approaches. And they sort of broke down the regulatory restrictions in every state in New England. It might be something that's worthwhile, taking a look at.
Yep.
What kind of
Just
data?
quickly, I wanted to say it's important to remember in Connecticut, it's not regulation, like it's not required, it's guidelines. And so anyone that doesn't want to follow a nature-based solution, they don't have to. Like they have a legal ramification that they don't have to. So that's something to push as well, right? Like let's make it a regulation.
Yeah, but what data would is there data that would show that putting Christmas trees under a dune would make a difference? And how much difference does it make? And how many Christmas trees do you need to make a difference like that? There's
that's sort of a crude, like it's not the greatest of examples, but there's I think plenty of data, and Stevens Institute, which I see here, I know they have a pile of this type of data, and of course it's all evolving. There's a lot that's been learned over the last 10 years. I think people are still collecting that data. It's not hard and fast, but other states are doing it, and I think we have to be, if we're really interested in doing nature-based features, I think there has to be a function of, there has to be some more acceptable risk taking as well, from like willing to like, hey, it's not all going to be perfect. There's going to, nature, nature is going to have to adapt and be a little bit more creative, because otherwise what happens is it really starts limiting you as to what how creative you can get on a design.
Yeah.
Very shortly, Kyle.
Yeah, I mean, I like the term nature-based features and nature-based approaches as opposed to nature-based solutions, because it's a solution to what, right? So a lot of these things are being asked to do a lot of things: reduce erosion, adapt to sea level rise, and reduce flooding. Like those are 3 different benchmarks for performance. So if it's not specified what type of performance and what the standards are, that can be tough. I think a lot of nature-based stuff that has been implemented has been done so for erosion that has already occurred and been seen, versus sea level rise to occur later.
Ilana,
I think there
do you
might
want
be
to
room
add?
to. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I think
So,
there might be room to
sorry,
explore.
go ahead.
Sorry, I keep interrupting. You go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that to the earlier point about maintenance of, I guess Dean brought it up. I wonder if there's some component of this that is about tying a financing mechanism for continued, like something to do with, there's some financing and funding component that model that is tied to the nature-based solution performance, and some mechanism through, I don't know what, but I feel like there's some, there's a way to operationalize it that needs to be explored. Sorry, Alex, go ahead. And nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. I was going to say that I think in terms of data analysis, I mean, for example, if you were to do a research project and looked at the Metro North Amtrak berm locations, where it's where there are opportunities for nature-based adaptation approaches along that berm, and quantify the potential benefits of investing in that kind of approach along a particular set of features in Connecticut, or if you picked inland marsh areas or other kinds of configurations and started to help define action sites across the Connecticut coast that could be replicated. I think that might be an interesting way forward.
Thank you. I'm gonna move to the next one because we have 2 more. Wind hazards, and it is interaction with the power grid resilience. Are there any risk that is impacting general like operations today? It's like what is the biggest gap in this terms, in terms of like the prediction or infrastructure or the response to grid resilience? Ilana?
I think this is also an asset data issue. Significantly, it's like sometimes the the utilities don't always, I mean, they have some information, or the information is in a different department, or there's some security concerns about sharing the data publicly. So, in terms of vulnerability of the power systems. So, from my perception, there's kind of two issues. One is, future climate and wind is, I mean, it's not as much certainty around the climate modeling around wind as opposed to precip or heat, or sea level rise. So that's on the hazard side, but I think on the asset side, there's kind of spottiness in the data in many instances, and sometimes difficult to get accurate data.
Kyle?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. And I think there's two parts to it. I think definitely the enforcement, okay, even if you had a better model, what would you do with it? Are you going to take that and revisit your state building code to actually enforce people to do things differently? Or are you still relying on people to make asset level decisions that they feel are in their best interest? On the modeling and the hazard data side, yeah, there's still a lot of uncertainty. I think a challenge, especially in the Northeast, is a lot of the wind modeling that has been done on the East Coast is really specific to tropical storms and hurricanes, as opposed to nor'easters, which are kind of a lot of our prevailing wind patterns are regional patterns. So, I mean, there have been some regional climate models that have been done. I don't think they're really getting utilized a lot within ensembles of the stuff that's informing the larger decisions on building codes and such.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, when it's come up in work that we've done on a local level, there's just sort of lack of readily accessible data that's granular enough to be meaningful, right? So we tend to make just broad generalizations, or for an entire community, say. So that's the thing that I see, which is a very different question than thinking about grid sensitivity. So, yeah, that would be the one sort of add that I would have to that conversation.
Okay, so I'm hearing about not accurate data, not enough data. So it's related kind of the risk quantification and also the not granular enough. So anyone else who wants to add to this?
Well, I could challenge people to say what would be useful to do or deliver, and if you had a better local product, could you use it?
I mean, I think our experience at the community level is people are so focused on flooding and heat right now that wind is not, not at top of mind at all for the communities that we've worked with in Connecticut, and I would say across New England. I don't know. I know Eric just hopped off. I don't know if anybody else has had a different experience, but that's been mine.
It's interesting because, I mean, a lot of the damages come from wind events, right? Like the insurance industry will talk about wind events on the Cape here in Massachusetts or, other states. I just don't know, especially since those are a lot of times driven by very strong storms versus averages increasing slowly over time. They're very event-based decisions. So unless you're updating building codes for extremes, it's not like you're slowly changing based on averages going up slightly, as would be the case for flooding and heat.
Yeah, and I would echo that. A lot of the wind events are coupled with storms, which are it's a multi-hazard event, right? And so people aren't necessarily thinking about wind in isolation. It's more of the power went out, there was a major storm, it caused flooding, wind was impacting both debris and power lines, etc. So I think it's often coupled.
It's interesting point you made there, Diana, about and we've been involved with the insurance division and with power companies on wind hazards, and insurance companies in particular have big losses from wind damage, and so I think that drives there. And they don't cover; they've got no exposure for flood damage because the federal government covers that. But the power companies are interested in making sure their wires don't come down. But what we hear from towns is true. It's all about flooding, and they don't really. And maybe that's because there's nothing they can do really about the power system and the wind damage is not as pervasive or persistent. Yeah, it's fine, but I mean, I think this group is probably more focused on the losses and preventing losses from flooding too.
I wonder if it's also where the solution is applied. Like from what I've observed, a lot of the wind mitigation is building scale. So that would come in just under a different team. You know, it's just not us working at like the civil landscape scale, you know, because it is mandated through the building code.
Yeah, we work at the building scale, so it's definitely, there definitely are, you know, ASCE kind of maps that are looking at future climate, wind speeds and maps, and basically, you know, often the recommendation is just to use kind of an increased, you know, basically if you look at those maps, there's kind of a, you just sort of move up farther north and kind of design to a greater wind intensity.
I mean, that feels like that is an area where a, you know, regulatory component, a building code component could much more easily come into play and be implemented than a lot of the other hazards that we've talked about.
So but the Insurance Commission would say, what I've heard from recently is that they think, and this, I guess this happened 10 years ago too, that they want to charge higher insurance rates along the in zip codes along the shoreline, for example. And they think that the high wind damage is, I guess data show high wind damage is more prevalent along the shoreline than it is inland. So whether that's true or not, and whether it will be persistently true in the future is, I think, a question. It's unresolved.
I'm going to move to the last one now. It is the heat and health risk. And we know that like the heat generally varies from neighborhood to neighborhood too. So if you would have like a street level data, would that help with any kind of a design solutions that you would propose?
So I have a lot of thoughts on heat.
Go ahead.
So I think, and particularly heat and health.
Yeah.
And I've been hanging out a lot with, you know, folks in the public health community and talking about the same thing. And I think that's an area, I'll just say that where there's opportunity for, you know, for kind of intersectional collaboration. But I do think, yeah, one of the things we see on the smaller scale is that, you know, the data that we have readily available may not capture sort of the human experience of heat at the street level. So I think that is a reasonable statement. The other thing that we see though is looking at New England in particular, there are many, many rural areas, and those are places where we are not talking about heat or heat resilience in the same ways as the large cities. So I think there's also a need and potentially a missed opportunity there as well. I think also thinking about ways that we could better quantify the impacts of heat into BCAs would be valuable. And that's something that, you know, I'm very interested in, is how do we make that step to sort of quantify heat related impacts. Yeah, I think those are my main points, but yeah, I'm glad to see this as one of the topic areas, one of the themes.
Great. Dana?
Yes, agreed with Diane. I think the other thing that sometimes, you know, on our clients sometimes don't always, we can't always quantify the cost of heat risk in the same way that a flood risk. It's obviously there's a damage cost. There might be functional downtime, similar with wind and power outage and other hazards. So I think there's often a disconnect between the public, like the cost to public health and the cost of implementing more heat resilience measures or heat reduction measures, who pays for those versus who benefits, there is a disconnect. So I think there's kind of the cost to public health, to the state, to whoever is paying those health costs, and the cost of lost work, and I think there's a connection there, and being able to quantify those numbers to justify more investment, I think would be valuable. I know there's been some research done on that, but I think that would really help make a stronger case.
Great. Anyone else who would like to add to this?
Just to say, from the landscape architecture perspective, I think there's a lot of interest in heat mitigation at the street level. And that's kind of where you're managing street planting and other kinds of design decisions. So I do think it's relevant.
Yeah. Any last things to add? Okay. So the quantification of the heat risk and also its like high resolution data is something that I'm hearing across. And with that, we are done with the teams. I'm going to give the floor to Luann to talk about like the policy perspective. These are the slides, right? So I'll share that real quick.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because it's been a little gratifying to me to hear this discussion that we're all pretty much on the same page in identifying a lot of the issues and challenges in this space. As far as the grant work goes in discussions with the PIs about how to talk about all these various themes that we're interested in and how to tie that into policy. Really, we need to have those discussions about themes, about what's actionable, what's science, and the policy should flow from that. So that's how we're sort of thinking about how this will work in the next few months as we sort of develop these policy priorities. And then also, as Jim said, one of the things that we're hoping about this whole process and the people that we're interacting and the different stakeholders and groups is that no matter what happens going forward with this grant process into phase 2, whether things are funded or not, we are definitely hoping that we can come up with some policy priorities garnered from both the science and from the issues that practitioners are seeing in the field that we can then, transmit to those policymakers who are making these decisions at the state and local level for inclusion. So I think this process will be helpful. So, really what we're seeing as the biggest challenge, I think, in the legal world is that law tends to travel far behind observable and predicted conditions. And when we're talking about the kinds of rapid changes that we're seeing coming about from climate change, that problem is only exacerbated because when you try to do these kinds of solutions to address some of these issues, you find yourself stuck by a regulation that is based upon maybe decades old assumptions and understanding. And so to try to address that, we need to identify those gaps between where the standards should be and where they are that put people and infrastructure at risk. And so what we're also thinking about in terms of this too is that we really want to try to develop these policy priorities that are really based in evidence, in science, and that can lead to changes in legal authority that can make adaptation and resilience move forward smoothly. So what we're trying to do at this point is figure out what these research priorities will be, and then look at the existing state level policy and figure out where those gaps exist. So I've been taking copious notes today throughout this discussion as people have identified different areas in which they've already seen that the work they would like to do is hindered by these lags in the way policy guidelines standards exist. Okay, so we can have the next slide, please. Thanks. So, one of the things that we want to think about is that there are really two things. We want to develop policy that's based on measurable science, but we also need to make sure at the same time that the people making that policy are knowledgeable and aware of the climate risks and the tools that are available for addressing these vulnerabilities. And that's one of the missions of CIRCA that I think we've taken on over the last decade is to try to have those lines of communication with state level policymakers and local policymakers so that they understand the challenges that are presented based from climate change, but also their role in updating policy to reflect what needs to happen. And so, one of the things that we've also talked about today that's come up multiple times is that it's great to come up with these terrific policy initiatives. They can't be done in a vacuum. They have to be based on needs of the communities that are experiencing the problems and actionable science, but they also have to be tied to funding mechanisms, but also capacity building. You can come up with fantastic policy and see it sit there on a shelf and not be implemented if people don't understand how it could be useful and have the ability to both fund the issues and have people in place that can do the work. And so the other thing that also has come up in today's discussion too was we have seen times where there are conflicts between policy that would help out with climate resilience and adaptation, but it runs into other types of issues and problems that we also are trying to address. In Connecticut, for example, a big one is when we talk about development of housing and also affordability concerns. And so ideally, you want to try to come up with policy that is complementary, that has a much greater chance of actually becoming legislation or regulation that then can work and also be useful to people in the field that are doing the work, as well as local officials that are trying to come up with solutions for the problems they're seeing in their communities. And I wanted to give one example of flexible evidence-based policy, and I think this is one thing that Kyle had mentioned as well, is that what you really want to see are the incorporation of data into statutory issues and also regulation that can then be updated as conditions change. And so one example of this in Connecticut, we have Public Act 1882, which charged the University of Connecticut to publish a sea level rise change a scenario for Connecticut that's updated at least every 10 years. And then that's published by DEEP. It also incorporates information from NOAA and from other agencies as well. And it's been codified into statute in Connecticut General Statutes 2568-0. And then that has been incorporated into various other statutes. And so if you look at the Coastal Management Act, it refers back to this. And so as well as both state and local plans of conservation and development, hazard mitigation plans, and then also filtering down into local ordinances and regulation. And the beauty of this is that then you don't have to have law that is trailing behind. The law itself doesn't have to go through that long process where it's modified, changed, etc. You just have to change your scenario. And so as the scenario changes, the law is entrained and follows along with that as well. And so thinking about ways to incorporate these kinds of flexible standards within statutes is one way that we can sort of look to the future and incorporate that right into the policy. So those are the kinds of things that we're thinking about, and I can, off the top of my head, think about ways that you could incorporate metrics like that for heat, for example. You could incorporate them for if-then type scenarios. If things reach a certain level, then different provisions would kick in, things like that. So that's hopefully what we can come out of this. That's really all I have. So if anybody has any comments on that, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think the performance-based standards is something that is going to have to be addressed, and it's great when you have flexible standards that can be updated. I think part of the challenge is what are the thresholds predefined that are going to make that change happen. In the industry, we often refer to adaptation pathways as like a planning approach. It's like if you reach 6 more inches of sea level rise by 2030, then you go up to the next curve or something like that. Like that's not really something that's integrated into regulatory standards yet, or it's not clear. I think that's a challenge that all of us have is like what is going to make a DEP change their mind that they need to go to the next level, and that like clarity on that ahead of time would be very helpful for practitioners. But like when you're seeing it at the time a rule change is being proposed and you have to do a public comment, and you have 60 days.
Yep.
That's very tough.
Yeah, and all of these things, add time, expense, and energy into trying to get these things changed as they need to be changed as well.
I would just quickly say that I think that the sea level rise component in Yukon, I mean in Connecticut, was partly because Circa was doing the sensor data collection, was doing the data collection, was able to position itself as an expert in that area, and the timing of it, and so there was a very customized situation in terms of how that influenced the policy. But it's a great model, and maybe there are other examples like that where there's expertise that can be fed into that decision making process in a similar way. There's also work happening on the design side, I think, in terms of innovation and creative strategies that go beyond regulation that might be worth looking at.
Can you give any examples of that?
Well, there are projects where the design professionals basically convince or negotiate with developers to go beyond the regulations around energy performance of buildings, or around buffers around ponds or waterways, and so it's part of it is negotiating with developers and having kind of forward-thinking developers that see it as like a sustainability or resilience marketing value for their projects.
We've seen also, some communities that have adopted incentives into their zoning codes that give developers, some reason to do or incorporate those things into their designs. That's been a little bit effective, I think, but it's always a trade-off for what are you giving away when you do that. So
yeah,
thanks. If that's all the discussion we have, I'll turn it over to John.
Okay. So, so I think now we just want to have a discussion, open discussion. We have some questions that we wanted to ask you all and get your feedback and perspective on. This is the list here. So we can talk about any of this, but I wanted to start with the first one, which is if we're taking a step back and we're looking across the Northeast and we're thinking about climate adaptation and resilience, based on what we've presented here, there's two questions that come to my mind. There's one is sort of, is there something about what we talked about that jumps out as that's the thing, or that's the set of issues that really is presents the barrier to the towns that you work with across the Northeast? So that's one question. And then the second is there something that we haven't talked about at all, that represents the bigger adaptation issue that needs to be addressed through research and innovation, that we haven't talked about, we're not focused on. So I'm just going to pose those first two, and then maybe if folks want to throw up a hand, if you want to jump in, we can do it that way. Kyle.
I mean, maybe it's a little bit towards 2 and 3, which is there's still so much wild, wild west of modeling tools and like what to use in specific scenarios. I think there's also opportunity and challenges here that are going to rise by people using machine learning and AI just like for different purposes, right? So like I could see some huge opportunities for it to be a good thing, like using machine learning to fill gaps between sparse tide gauge data to make localized site decisions. But I could also see it being used in the wrong way for people using proprietary models for inland flooding that are not vetted elsewise and become black box. So I definitely think a little bit of a either here's what we want from machine learning and AI guardrails. I see huge opportunities for it to be helpful, but I see also ways that it could be maladaptive as well.
Elsa.
I am really interested and feel like it's really compelling to think about giving municipalities, giving towns a head start on that stormwater mapping. You know, one of the things I heard come out is, and we know how labor intensive, field checking, getting inverts. What if we could find a funding mechanism, you know, some sort of grant application where we could build those baseline models so that then it just becomes a matter of adding to them each time. That I think would get over a funding hurdle of communities being able to then use this model in a powerful way for solution and not have to, you know, build it initially. New York City has, DEP has developed their InfoWorks model of their entire CSO system, and it gives them this sort of like overarching power. The entire thing is they did it once, it's integrated, you know, they have such complicated CSOs, but now they know every single time they patch a new design into that, they know the effect on the entire system. So it's just really interesting to think about to give us a leg up.
Yeah, so establishing some kind of foundational data management framework, which it sounds like the state has been trying to move in that direction a little bit, you know, like they now are requiring all the towns to collect information about their culverts and things like that. So, but okay. Alana?
I think what's always useful, and I know it exists, but not always in a consolidated way, are demonstrated case studies that are showing, you know, performance over time. They don't necessarily have to be, you know, local, but solutions where we can see post-occupancy, post-construction or post-implementation performance, and having access to those examples kind of in a more comprehensive way, I think can go a long way for, you know, to convince folks, for example, of the nature-based solutions or other solutions.
That's a policy thing. I think that the only way that's going to happen is if there's a requirement in a permit that
for case studies.
No, for ongoing evaluation of project effectiveness.
I see.
So like in this, so I was part of that NROC thing that Dean mentioned earlier, and clearly there are so few of these projects that have been constructed that they're all kind of experimental, yet none of them are really measuring waves or have a routine resurvey initiative. And if you try to impose that on every project, you know, there would be a lot of pushback. But without doing that, we're never going to have sort of an inventory of data with which to assess the long-term effectiveness, the long-term maintenance costs of these things. And so I think there needs to be sort of a link to permits that requires them to do this kind of stuff, or the state just has to fund them. And maybe there's some intermediate case where you have to do it and you get like a subsidy.
Yeah, it sort of again it ties back to the operational funding comment earlier. Yeah, That makes sense. Are there other locations, John, like in the Netherlands or other places where if you're familiar with, if they are kind of required to do monitoring of their flood protection solutions?
That's a good question. I don't know, but
Yeah, I don't know if they're anywhere in the country where they're, I mean, the Corps of Engineers does it with beach protection systems. You know, there's but they do it themselves. It's not like they impose upon the town, I don't think, to do it.
And do they share the results of those? So I think that, yeah, that sort of theme, I guess, is where I think there'd be a lot of value.
Yeah, that's I think the outcome of an initial. If you were going to design a system to do it right, you would want to have a requirement to monitor it, a requirement to make the data shareable and accessible, and that's a really useful policy decision. I think a policy project would be useful.
yeah, so we got performance standards for nature-based solutions for sure.
And
And that's also the case with heat too.
and
right? Like
monitoring projects.
what type of trees are actually the most effective? How long do you have to care for them? All those kind of questions about heat mitigation come up too with nature-based solutions. And let's see, I'm gonna pass it to Diane.
Yeah, so I'll touch on a couple points. I do think there is, one thing that we hear often, and this maybe gets to the private sector question that's down at the end of your list, is, exactly what is really the return on investment? Because if something's not required by regulation, what's the motivation to do that? Where's the cost savings or the long-term, ROI for things? And I think it's the more that we can make that case, and it's been much better established for the building sector, where they've been able, now I think it's the National Building, I'm not going to get the acronym right. It's like the National Building something Institute, do you know that, has very good evidence of like, invest in this and you get this return back against these certain types of hazards. So the more that we can show that, the more it sort of makes the case for the regulatory to do that. And then the other thing I just want to surface, I guess, is I noticed in the discussion of hazards, there's been no focus on wildfire. And the reason I bring it up is because I've heard recently, specifically New England is particularly challenging in dealing with wildfire, because unlike other parts of for two reasons. One, because unlike other parts of the country where we have large landowner tracts, in New England, it tends to be a lot of much smaller landowners that own this forest land, in particular forest land. So it becomes harder to get a management strategy together. So I think it's going to take more to face that challenge in New England. So do we need to be thinking about it more? And then associated with that, I guess also the research is showing that these sort of flash droughts that we have in the fall are also kind of increasing our wildfire risk. So maybe not this round of this grant, but I just wanted to kind of put that out there because it is something that I know we didn't talk about, but I've been hearing more about as a growing concern.
Yeah, two things. One is on your question number one. I see a big hole in general among states about talking about or planning for organized retreat. And sure, you do projects and FEMA will fund or NRCS will fund like acquisition of additional structures, but I think the scale of retreat to be able to manage today's threats, never mind the threats from 50 years from now, no one's planning for, and we're not going to grant our way out of that scale of retreat. And coming up with a more creative approach where to facilitate that retreat than just starting buying out, multi-million-dollar houses. On this, the other thing I'd like to address is the training and professional development opportunities. There's certainly some practitioners very familiar with it. I would hazard to say that a big majority of the practitioners struggle with risk-based design and adaptive designs. And I think to really make climate resilience projects cost effective, you have to really lean into risk-based and adaptive management designs. And granted, I haven't sat through a civil engineering program at a university in a long time. I'm guessing, talking to new graduates, that that's not really being addressed. And like I said, just my own personal experience, I'm involved in a project in Rhode Island where I'm representing a client, and another consultant is working on a very large multi-tens of $1 million design, and they have no understanding of risk-based or adaptive management design. And that's one example that's sort of close to home for me. But that, I think, people better understanding that design approach would do a lot to making these projects cost effective.
Jim, did you have something on that, or?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on Diane's point first, which was that there are in other parts of the country R2I2 initiatives funded to look at wildfire risk, but they're probably not thinking about the point that you just made about the scale of the property ownership. So it's a really valuable thing. I think we should try and pass on. Mm-hmm. And then to Dean's point about accelerating retreat as an option, I think I've been thinking about that and trying to identify what are the obstacles that are making it difficult. And one, I think, is drawing a line in the map and saying these places are places where you should be retreating from, and these other places are not. Because if we identify those places, then we can start trying to develop incentives and regulations that would make progress on advancing it. But without like very clear methodologies and that are defensible in court about drawing that line, I don't think we can make much progress.
Kyle?
And you know what? It becomes people raise houses, right? Like they'll get funding to raise their house.
Yep.
And as soon as the neighborhood gets raised, the pressure is on the community to raise roads and protect infrastructure so as people can be in the house, throughout any flood. And now you have a problem. And yeah, and Jim, I don't want to spend a lot of time with this. Out of pure professional curiosity, I've been doing some thinking about this too. And I have to believe there's a solution.
Yeah.
I want to say Robinson Cole, by the way, was doing some thinking about this a few years ago, like legal approaches to.
That's good to know.
As a municipal, in their municipal practice, and I don't know how far they got with it, but just FYI.
Okay, Kyle.
Yeah, I'd echo a little bit of both of those. So the risk-based approaches and ROI discussions, like a good corollary there is those are very much used by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in their big coastal storm risk management programs. But local municipalities are not all going to get a coastal storm risk management program with core federal cost share to do cost benefit analyses and ROI on risk-based design. So I feel like a lot of the people that are coming out of universities that are very informed in risk-based design, they get gobbled up by critical infrastructure transportation companies and the Corps. They're not the people going to firms to work on local municipal shoreline projects, right? So I think there is definitely a gap in that type of expertise that gets to some entities but not to others. I would also say, like, in thinking about manager retreat and incentives, like there's a good case study of the NFIP and CRS program participation. Like there are ways that would incentivize communities to do more locally to get more prepared for flood programs and buyouts. But why are they not more effective than they are? Right. So like community rating system does have a lot of buy-in in like North Carolina, some would say in New Jersey, places that have seen hurricanes and repeated flooding, but participation in Massachusetts is pretty minimal. So I think there's geographic differences and lessons that we learned, like before you start creating new programs and new things for manage retreat, what are the failures or things that could have been improved from a better community rating system program? And I think that also has challenges too, because if you're trying to enforce things at state levels, like, are you creating something that competes with CRS? Are you like, that's tied to how insurance sector works? Like that's a program that was created for insurance reasons.
Well, FEMA's going away anyway, so we don't have to worry about that. Alex.
These are all good points. I think I just want to emphasize a point that I think Dean was making about this kind of shifting between design scenario development and educating and working with design professionals and engineers around innovative applications and strategies that then can maybe feed back into some of the into some of the data modeling and also the interface that the data modeling has with either the public or with municipal managers. In a way, that was some of the thing. Those are some of the things we were trying to do, through Studio and through that kind of, and getting young engineering students working alongside design professionals to think outside the box and creatively. And I mean, we are basically facing, increased sea level rise, increased heat. So we know that those are going to be turning up over time or increasing over time. And so more and more people are going to be trying to look for solutions in the future. We can kind of anticipate that and start to lay the groundwork for those future conditions where people are more are looking for solutions. And where today we're trying to convince municipal managers who are risk averse to make decisions based on future predictions or on examples of risk events that have occurred, which is kind of harder sell. I think we can kind of anticipate future conditions and try to lay the groundwork for that time frame through through creative design, and coupling that with the data collection strategies that we're talking about today.
Yeah, so that makes me think of a way to create a project-based learning program that kind of brings together a few of those things for specific projects, and then that's feeding back into the curriculum.
Let's talk about that a little bit more and get the practitioners' input on it. Like, what academic? There's two kinds of academic things that we do. One is for teaching. One would be a degree program, like bachelor's and master's, and then there's in-service learning initiatives that we have, certificates. And I'd like to know what people think would be the most valuable things that we could do, that should be done across the region, and not just UConn, other institutions too, that would be helpful to produce people that would accelerate adaptation.
Yeah, like if we had a 12-week professional development or professional certificate program that circa, or maybe this group of collaborators created for the Northeast, what should it focus on? Beth?
I just want to go back to what Alex was mentioning. It would be incredibly useful, especially for mid-career and beyond, to be able to engage with other disciplines in an open forum. We do a lot of interdisciplinary work professionally, but it's often bound by our disciplines, and you move the needle a little bit, but you have a contract, you have a budget, you have a schedule that has to be adhered to. And so you end up working in a way that works for your discipline, but doesn't necessarily engage or open up to other disciplines in a way that you might in an academic setting. If you had the freedom of an academic setting to dive in and really understand and explore synergies between engineering and design disciplines, you'd come away with a new found appreciation of what could be achieved through those synergies. I think when you engage in that work as in your earlier years, pre-professional years, you don't have the professional experience to lean back into. So there's new things that could be understood and gained and achieved through a bit of a interdisciplinary studio.
Okay, I see we have a lot of hands, so I think this is exciting. Let's see, Dean?
Yeah, I would lean towards, obviously, bachelor's degree, master's degree programs can always be updated, but people are very inexperienced. They're learning basic skills. I think there's certainly value there, but I do believe, echoing Beth here, that like a mid-career professional certification program would be very valuable with people with some more experience, have seen some things, and get into a more in-depth evaluation. And frankly, that professional certification, maybe there's multiples, but nature-based design I see as another big hole among most. Actually, I'll lean heavy into most practitioners would struggle with. I see and struggle with understanding what that really is. And then the adaptive, like creative, adaptive, risk-based design approaches to climate resilience. So that's my feedback.
Alana?
Yeah, so I just to echo both Beth and Dean's comments, I would also I think, a great model that for learning, which I think has been very successful more on the decarbonization sustainability side, has been the solar decathlon, where students, like in multiple disciplines, you've got, architects, engineers, landscape architects, construction administration students, etc., working together on a project that gets built over a certain amount of time. I know Alex has done some sort of pilot projects as well with his students, but I think something similar where you have that interdisciplinary project exercise, whether it's a pilot project or something where you're really collaborating, but through some sort of a pilot or sort of somewhat real world application, I think would be very valuable.
Okay, Diane?
So I'm gonna push back maybe a little bit on Dean and Beth's comment, and that is that I feel like it's very easy to in my experience, it's very easy to capture the students coming out, maybe the very, very early career professionals. It is extremely, or I think, much harder to capture the mid-career professionals because of the stress they already have going on in their work, right? And in their lives. So it's much harder to tell them, like, okay, now we really think you should go get the certificate and do the certificate program. And the ones who feel that are probably already seeking out those opportunities. That's my own personal viewpoint, my own personal experience. So I think there's sort of a two-pronged approach to this. One is, do you lean into the students now with the idea that as the workforce ages out, that we will just have a whole generation of engineers and planners and designers that have this embodied in the way that they do work. Like that's the end goal for all of us, right? Is that this is how we approach engineering, this is how we approach design. So do we lean into that heavier, or do we at the same time have something out there for the mid-career people that, quite frankly, are probably going to be career switchers? People who, because we saw this in quote unquote sustainability, where there were master's programs and certificate programs that came up when decarbonization and sustainability was, ESG was a growing thing. And we had all these people switch from different fields or sort of related fields into sustainability. Now I think there's a glut because there's been sort of a pullback on ESG and sustainability at the corporate level, at least in many cases. But how do you capture those people? What's going to be the incentive? Does it have to be short enough, focused enough? Do you have to get engineering companies throughout Connecticut to incentivize, or the region to incentivize this? Otherwise, how are you, you know, like, how do you capture them if you want to get those mid-career professionals? The early ones, you'll get them. And we'll get there that we don't need to talk about certificates and programs, because if we do it right, they'll know how to do it. But how do we get those mid-level people, or do we just hope they get carried along with the with the tide, so to speak, and we'll come around to that way of doing it if they're engaged in that kind of work?
Elsa?
I so fully support what Diane is saying. I was thinking exactly the same thing. Like the early career professionals that I'm coming across, Diane, like it is infused in their ethos. They would not think of working any other way. And there's a tremendous amount of frustration, right? Because then they enter into the industry and realize that it doesn't really happen that way. And the mid-career professionals, so in our industry, my observation is you get really good at doing what you need to do every day. And the ones that would be looking for that like extra level of knowledge exactly would be the ones that are trying to switch from the rut that they're in and try and bring in more of that advanced resiliency work. And so I'm wondering, like, maybe there's a series of quick, like 20-minute modules or something that you can do for those early or mid-career folks that are interested, want to grow a little bit, don't have a tremendous amount of time, but are looking to just really solidify what they're doing every day, like give them more exposure to things in the region, give them, links to resources, that sort of thing. So just wanted to echo that I agree with that 100%.
Okay, Beth, want to have a response?
Yeah, I think I want to add, when we first started this conversation, we were talking about a 12-week program, and maybe instead I completely agree with you, Diane, Kyle, about the time commitment that you would expect from someone who's starting a family and, achieving licensure, et cetera. And maybe it's just a day-long charrette so that it would be a CEU opportunity, but these kind of these modules that allow you to engage with other professionals to a level with some degree of meaning, and explore the interactions between your disciplines and the way that the two might shape each other to come up with an outcome that has true co-benefits or achieves adaptation.
Yes, yeah, I think that from the perspective of a professor, right, that's not the kind of stuff we do. I'm okay with that. I just want to understand what's most effective. The professional societies, AMS, ASCE, flood managers groups, they kind of run those kinds of short courses, and I think that's not something we should tread into, but we could support through an initiative, coordination of a coherent program in collaboration with those groups. But I'm also wondering, like, are there changes to existing undergraduate initiatives or graduate programs that would be effective?
And Alex, you had your hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, this is an area I like to think about, but I think that in the undergraduate, graduate level, I think creating interdisciplinary teams with engineering, design, ecology in working group strategies, I think is great, especially if my approach with that is to try to cultivate friendships and connections that then last after graduation. I think the way that I've tapped into mid-career professionals is through negotiating projects that bridge between academia and industry partnership projects, and then that brings the mid-career industry person into a relationship with. Usually I try to tap graduates so that they're kind of a bit more advanced and can kind of start to keep up with the mid-career person. But there's a lot of learning that happens for the younger recent academic, but also I think there's a lot of ways of educating the mid-career engineer or the mid-career practitioner by giving them an interface with some people in the academia that have that expertise and knowledge that kind of can shift some of their thinking. and then you do it with a client who pays for the outcomes, and you work out the relationship between industry and academia so that the product is you produce a viable product. I think one issue with that is you're then competing with other firms.
Diane?
So just a couple quick thoughts. We and Fuss and O'Neill has done this over the years, but recently, a couple of years ago, I was involved with a capstone project with Smith College and their engineering program. And you know, initially they're sort of like, hey, you can participate in this, and like you know, and there's sort of you're encouraged to like provide a donation. And you know, to be perfectly frank, our thought was like, our donation is our time. Like you've got 12 students working with senior engineers, or whatever, or 6 students working with senior engineers. That's what we can give you, you know, because this wasn't a real project. This was sort of a adjacent project, right? Because what can, you know, you got to be realistic in what you can accomplish. Having said that, it was I feel like they learned a lot. It was a green infrastructure related project. I will say that I think we learned a lot in terms of, like, they were so far outside the box because they weren't constrained or fettered by, you know, all the traditional design knowledge that necessarily we had. So it was a good experience in that way. So how do you, my question is, because, and somebody brought it up earlier, everybody's like, there's a budget, there's a schedule. It's really hard to bring students in to actual projects and have them work on them because of all those factors. So how do you incentivize engineering firms to give that time? So that's one question mark. The other is, I don't think we'll ever, I mean, I don't know. I will never see this in the mid-sized engineering firms, but wouldn't it be amazing if there was some sort of sabbatical program for mid to senior level engineering staff, engineering planning design staff, to be able to spend that time, to have that length of time to do that deep dive in the knowledge? You know, you know, I'm going to use you as an example, Dean. Dean did not start out as a resilience engineer, right? So it was basically a recreation, probably 3 times in his career, at least while he was at Fuss and O'Neill. And it's, how do you give people that space to create or recreate themselves in a way that's really meaningful? I don't know the solution to that. I think there's some people will just do it because they're driven. But I think that's, how do we find more opportunities like that if we need to really build that that knowledge base within the community?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's the kind of thing that NSF could fund, right? Like, I'm not exactly sure what, you know, how much money, etc., it would take, and how to be effective and stuff. But a new educational initiative that's got measurable impact and scalable and sustainable, that's something we're looking to do.
Alana?
So I'll add, as someone at a very big engineering firm, it's a great observation. We do a lot of work with like our grads and our interns, and then there's all this leadership training, and we do have, a 2-day design school, kind of that sort of integrated design for the mid-grade levels. But I also see that that's when, to an earlier point, we have a lot of change. Some people, will leave, or they'll transition to the owner's side. And that's actually like a very vulnerable part of the staff, is at that turning point of, mid-grade or mid-level. And so, developing an opportunity for them to grow in their careers, and to, acknowledge them in a more comprehensive way, I think is a fantastic idea. How that gets, if there's funding available for that, and then, you get a selection process from firms, to send folks, for more than 2 days, I very, very supportive of that idea.
And let me make one final question, because we got to wind up pretty soon. It's 12 o'clock, right? But what would incentivize people like you guys to actually participate in teaching something like that? And you time off and pay and permission of your companies, etc., I guess. But
I guess it's a question of the commitment, right? Like, what's the level of commitment? How long is it? And it's also for those folks, as somebody mentioned, some of them have young children at that point. They're
Mhm.
they're sort of leading projects. So it's also kind of like a, what is the right, how do you right size something like that type of a training to make it manageable for everybody? Is it spaced out over, a couple of weekends, or is it, what is the appropriate model? I think it's, to manage people's time.
They better rank
I would-
up.
Yeah, maybe
I would
we'll
agree.
do one more and then we'll wind up after this. Go ahead, Kyle.
I would agree. It's the time commitment. I mean, at the end of the day, the private sector, time is money, right? If you're not utilized billable, other than those of us that sit in business development professions where we're not expected to be, yes, we can go do industry lectures, but would you get something better from the project managers who are expected to be billable to actually share that back to the people doing the project or the next generation or mid-level professionals? I think it's how do you account and incentivize the time of the people that you want, and not just us running a business line speaking to all these great projects that our colleagues are doing.
Elsa, one final point.
Yes, I'll be very quick. I'm thinking, so first of all, when we're talking about training, like what specific area, there's so much under that we potentially want to train people around. And I feel like one of the last themes that we left was this idea of the risk-based approach and wondering, like, is that being taught through the university programs? And so just totally, this is, throwing noodles at the wall and just thinking out loud to plant a seed. But again, in Massachusetts, they enacted that MVP, like pre-training program. You had to be trained within their risk-based system to then be able to be one of the practitioners. Like that's kind of a hook, right? Like getting the people at that level and then training them around that risk-based solution. That's industry-wide.
Okay. Jim, do you have any?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone.
Close out our
Meeting. It's been very helpful. It's the first time we tried to do it, and it's been worked out much better than I expected. So we've got a lot of information, and I heard a lot of things that were new, and it's great to hear people when people agree on some things as being important too. So we'll consolidate what we've done, what we've heard, and share it. And I hope that you'll be willing to participate again in our next phase. I'm not quite sure when that is
so
yet.
What are we doing next?
We're going to create a report and then share it, and then we'll try and figure out, how to make the best use of what we've learned, and we'll get back to everyone, on what the schedule is going to be for our next steps.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add that we'll be continuing this conversation at the Earth Day event conference. The registration is live, so I'm going to put it in the chat. We'll have other PIs there, and hopefully some municipal and agency staff can get involved in this conversation.
So that's at the UConn Law School, April 17th. There's a conference, and we'll be assembling some of the other PIs from this grant and having probably more of a policy discussion at that one, since it is the law school. But if you're interested, you can join us there for that.
Obviously these technical science engineering questions are overlap with policy, because they're just if you want to make them relevant, you've got to be aware of the rules.
Okay, thanks everybody for participating.
Thank you, everybody.
Great assembly of knowledge.
Thank you.
Thank you so much
See
for
everybody.
the invitation. Bye-bye.
Yeah.